very honored to welcome Jane Sweetland here to present.
Thank you, JC, and thank you all, this intimate group, for gathering here on a Friday in June when you want probably to be in McCall or somewhere else. Thank you for being here tonight. It's really delightful for me to present this story because it's such an inspiring moment of American history that very few people know about. So let me give you the context of this talk. As JC said, it's about two trains. One was called the Friendship Train, and it crossed America in friendship to go to France to deliver food. So it's a food train loaded with food, which was loaded by the people of America, not by the government. It came from people's kitchens and pantries. A year later, France reciprocated with the Merci train, and every state got a boxcar. So these two trains are linked in time and thought, and that's one of the things that I'm going to be talking to you about, because this period of time from 1947 to 1949 is the beginning of the Cold War. And there were two ideologies, communism and democracy, that were fighting essentially to win the hearts and minds of Europeans. So two trains, one in 1947 from the US and one about a year later from France, in gratitude. So despite the fact that the whole scope of this story goes from 1947 to 49, to understand it, you have to understand what America gave and for what the French were grateful for. And that is, America fought for the French in two world wars. World War I was 1914 to 1918. We didn't enter until 1917, but French veterans, French fighters, remembered fighting side by side with the Americans, and they credited America with turning the tide of that war. Those veterans would have ridden in those boxcars. Those boxcars held either 8 men or 40, either 8 horses or 40 men. So 1918, fast forward about 20 years, we have another war. World War II began in September of 1939 when Hitler bombed Poland. But what is often overlooked is the fact that 1 week before he bombed Poland, Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler entered into what is called the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. They promised each other that they would not invade their sovereign nations for a period of 10 years. So this is August 1939. What Hitler got out of it is that he knew he was going to bomb Poland. He needed the USSR to stay out. What Stalin got out of it is he was still rebuilding his country from World War I. Stalin not only stayed out of the war in Poland, they kept their lights on in ways that would give coordinates or beacons for the Luftwaffe as they came in and bombed Poland. So then we have a period of time from September 1939. It only took Poland about 4 weeks to fall. We have a period of time that is called in German the Sitzkrieg, or the Sitting War, when really nothing much happened on land. There was submarine warfare at sea. In May of 1940, Hitler bombed Germany. Germany bombed France and invaded France. It took France only 6 weeks to fall. Despite the fact that they had Britain as an ally, both Britain and France had declared war on Germany after Germany bombed Poland. And what happened here, you can see that France, by the terms of the treaty in June of 1940, France was divided. It was a divided country with the north called the German occupation zone. The Germans occupied that zone, and the south was called the free zone. But that's really a misnomer. It was not free. It was governed from Vichy, which is a city in southern France, in kind of the center. And, whoops, I'm not quite tall enough, but that's called the Vichy government, and it was really a puppet government of Germany. So this becomes important because within France there was a resistance against Hitler. But the French resistance was governed by Charles de Gaulle, who was exiled in Britain. And so there was a resistance, but it didn't have the strength that it was about to get from the communists. Now, this is important to understand. There is a lot of communism within France at the time. But when Stalin made an agreement with Hitler, then the communists said, okay, we're okay with that. We are not going to join the resistance. So then a year later, 1 year after France was bombed, Hitler made one of his many strategic errors, and that is he invaded the Soviet Union. This was a strategic error of magnificent force for many reasons, but one of them was it galvanized the communists within France to join the resistance. At this moment, in June of 1941, the French resistance became largely communist. And also, I should say at this point, at the end of World War II, two superpowers were emerging: the United States for democracy and the USSR for communism. And both countries knew that Europe, and France and Italy in particular, but they lay in the balance, that they would go either communist or democratic depending on who fed them. This is George C. Marshall, who was Harry Truman's Secretary of State. And this is before the Marshall Plan, which many of you will have heard of, but the Marshall Plan was not yet in place when France had been devastated by World War II. The fields were burned, the cows were too skinny to give milk. It was, in fact, illegal to provide milk for children for any family that did not have children 4 years old and under. And so Truman knew that what this says is people would vote for whoever gives them bread. So Truman said, okay, we have to do something, because not only was France devastated by the war, in 1946 and 47, the winter had been so terrible, and then there were spring floods, and then there was a summer drought. And they knew that unless they got food, people would starve. Truman's response to this was to develop this committee, which is called the Citizens Food Committee. And Truman, the president, President Harry Truman, is in the center, and to his, this guy is a man named Charles Luckman, who he designated to be the head of the Citizens Food Committee. Now, what is important about knowing that the Citizens Food Committee is two things. One is it's a conservation committee. Truman said in this article on October 1st, 1947, and I'm going to keep hitting this timeline because the timeline is absolutely remarkable. He says on October 1st, 1947, we are going to launch this idea that people can conserve from their tables. That the Secretary of Agriculture, who is also in this picture, had said, you know, people are wasting food. They're wasting about 10% of what comes on their farms or in the from their table. And Truman knew that the U.S. had 500 million bushels of grain in reserve, but they needed 600 million. So the other 100 million would come from people conserving. Well, so now there's starvation in France and Italy, and we need to do something about it. It's also true that people look at this period of history and think America was all together. In fact, there were a lot of divisions, because after the end of World War II, the GDP dropped, inflation rose, unemployment skyrocketed. Still, Americans knew that Europe was worse off. The slogan of the Citizens Food Committee is right here. Waste makes want, and want makes war. So enter into this conversation about conserving so we can give 100 million more bushels to the French. Enter into this conversation this man, whose name is Drew Pearson. He's a columnist. Some of you may remember the Washington Merry-Go-Round was his column. He was the most popular columnist of the time. He was in hundreds of newspapers nationwide. He also had a Sunday broadcast. He's a complicated character because he's a Quaker. He's absolutely peace-loving. And he is very worldly. His brother lives in France, so he knows exactly what is happening in France. And he has these columns. He's not really well respected in the journalist community, as one paper said. He published cocktail gossip as truth, but he was a brilliant showman. And so he gets his newspaper on October 1st, and he reads the front page, and he says, whoa, well, this is a good idea. But it doesn't go far enough. Because he says, Americans are already sending food, and they're already conserving, and they're already being rationed. There wasn't enough of everything for what people wanted. So he says, we're already sending food. The problem is this. Europe doesn't know it. So on October 11th, 10 days later, 10 days after Truman announces this conservation committee, he says, Europe should know who feeds it. And he writes this letter kind of brilliantly because it's an open column. It's an open letter to Truman's chairman of the CFC. And he says, hey, Charles, good idea. And then he tells the story of the Americans are sending care packages, they're sending through their churches, they're actually sending through the government, and they are sending many, many more times the food that the USSR is sending. But here's the deal. America is coming into the north of France, in Le Havre, and nobody knows it. It's just quiet. In the meantime, the USSR is coming into Marseille, and it's a school holiday. The schools are out, the kids are on the dock, the stores are closed because a Russian ship has come into port and bringing food. So what Pearson says in this October 11th column, he has an idea. Why don't we launch a friendship train? Now, on October 11th, he has no idea if this will actually work. He's kind of floating it. It's a floater balloon out there. Is this going to get any traction here? In fact, but he does what a good showman does. He actually says, and let's put a deadline on it. Let's get that trainload of food to France by Christmas. Now, any of you who have ever planned a family Christmas, you need more than a few weeks to do that. To get a ship across the ocean, it takes 2 weeks. To get a train across the country takes a while. He doesn't yet have the trains because, again, as you know, we don't have a national train line. You can't pick up the phone and call Mac and say, hey, I need a train to go from California to New York. You have to get them all lined up. He doesn't have that. But he nevertheless puts it out, and the response is overwhelming. His deadline, by the way, as I said, was Christmas. Between October 11th and October 26th, he gets all the trains lined up, he gets the Teamsters lined up, he gets all the unions saying we are going to donate our labor for free. He gets every civic organization, churches and synagogues, and everyone saying, count us in, we're on it. So, on November 8th, 1947, think about this. October 1st, the idea comes up. October 10th, he launches it. October 26th, he gets the train. And October 8th, in Hollywood, which they do know how to do one thing really well, which is parties, and 25,000 people joined in Hollywood while watch 150 actors, 8 boxcars on parade. This food came from every place in Southern California. 8 boxcars launched this train. I should also say that when Pearson got the trains lined up, he was asked, how many boxcars do you need? Well, he said, I don't know. So he said, let's make it a mile long. So maybe 120, maybe 150 boxcars, that's a good shot. We can maybe do that. He had no idea. But 8 boxcars leave Southern California. If you know anything about California, you know that Northern California is going to try to beat it. They didn't, but the boxcars went. On November 8th, that we have the 25,000 people launching it. Also, here's the governor of California. There, Earl Warren was there to ride the train from LA to Bakersfield, and that tradition was matched with every governor across the country. Now, I should say that the food was kind of a cool thing to have, but the food was really a symbol. It was really just a gesture. Pearson knew that whatever they could get in a mile-long train is just, hello, here's a snack for you. But what it was supposed to be and what it was is the message, the publicity. So he had a committee, and the head of that committee was Harry M. Warner of Warner Brothers Studios, one of the four brothers who started that studio. On that train, it began with 8 boxcars. Well, it actually began with 10 boxcars because one of them was filled with camera equipment, the other, and camera people who would, at every station, they would stop. They would take pictures of the crowd that was there. Because as Pearson wrote in all of his columns, this could not happen in Russia. This is people to people. So what I'm about to show you is just about a little less than 2 minutes of one of the newsreels. These films were made, and then they were sent to France and put in newsreels to at films. Here we go. Oh.
It's a green light and a clear track for the Friendship Train as it rolls across the salt flats of Utah and roars over the endless trestles spanning Great Salt Lake. Mile after mile over America's Great West speeds the train that is our personal answer as a nation to the hungry of Europe. Through the snowbound rangeland of the cattle country, this mighty symbol of America's generosity rolls ever eastward. Everyone has helped. Railroads have hauled the train free. Unions have donated labor. Civic organizations have banded to fill the cars with the needed food. The spirit of 48 states is in this enterprise, and at every stop, enthusiastic crowds gather to hear Drew Pearson, originator of the Friendship Train. All have worked. The big people and the little folks have pooled their efforts to fill the cars. From whistle stops off the main line to the metropolitan centers, cars are loaded with food and more food. Flour, milk, dried vegetables, dried fruit, canned vegetables, rice. These are the staples that pour into the Friendship Train night and day as it grows steadily, car by car, en route to the Atlantic seaboard. America's pioneers of the vast West once knew the meaning of hunger. Today, their descendants remember. Hundreds of thousands have joined in the mass effort, and the Friendship Train grows ever longer after each stop. It carries to Europe not an official government aid program, but the answer of a free people who have heard the cry of their neighbors in want. It is the free will offering by an America that wants to share.
So there you have it. Doesn't it kind of make you like, yay, you know, we actually did this? And so here is a picture, here's a map of the track that it took. As you can see, many states, including Idaho, were left off, but every state actually contributed. In the Southwest, Texas, Oklahoma, the breadbasket states enlisted yet another train to be added to the train in Utah. What Idaho did, I love what Idaho did, because the Statesman printed an article. Once it was launched, okay, October 26th, we've got it. The Statesman said, we don't have enough time. Can't do it. But they got so many phone calls and so many letters that they said, okay, just kidding, we will do it. In fact, Idaho sent train cars to both Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Ogden, Utah, and my favorite train from Idaho, my favorite boxcar from Idaho is the one from Moscow, which said, "This grain is from Moscow, Idaho, not Moscow, Russia." Here's the Idaho Statesman on November 8th. But after they relaunched, okay, we will do it. On the front page, it has the boxcar leaving Los Angeles. Now, while America is clearly bringing itself together to do this kind of unique humanitarian thing for the people of France, France was tearing itself apart. Here's a headline from an American newspaper that shows this division between the communists and the pro-democracy movement. The communists felt that any pro-democracy thing they tried to undermine. In fact, some communists sabotaged a train in Paris at this time, and 16 people died. So there's a lot of tension between the pro-communist groups and the pro-democracy groups. So Drew Pearson knew that even if we get this train across the country and across the ocean, he knew that it might not get unloaded because the unions were all striking. Any ships that came in from democratic nations would not be unloaded. So what he did, again, he's a brilliant showman and a strategist, and he sent an emissary whose name is David Carr, a very complicated person himself. He had worked for the Office of War Intelligence in Washington, D.C. He left kind of under a bit of a cloud there, and he also wrote for the Communist Press in the U.S. And perhaps it was that connection. We don't know what he said. But first, before we get the train to France, let's get it to New York. This is a picture of 30 of the boxcars were loaded onto a barge and paraded in front of the waterfront in New York Harbor. There was, remember, 25,000 people sent it off in Los Angeles. In New York, 250,000 people joined. Pearson had hoped for 150 or so boxcars. In the end, there were 720. He had planned to have one ship to sail everything, all the food from all those boxcars across the ocean. He ended up needing 4 ships. So again, the timeline. He wrote that first letter October 11th. He got the trains all lined up October 16th. These boxcars made it to New York November 18th, and the first shipped out to France on December 7th. And here is another picture. It's actually the front of the book that I wrote about it. There's 2 editions. They're exactly identical, except the older edition has a 1940s travel poster on the front, and this is an AP photo of that. I love this because it shows a connection. It's the barge of the Friendship train in 1947 in front of the Statue of Liberty, which was given to America in the 19th century to celebrate our 100th year of after the American Revolution, which, of course, France helped us win. So we don't know what David Carr said, but we do know that when the ship docked in Le Havre, which is in the north, quietly and with no big deal, it was unloaded, and the trains began to go south, the goods from all of this food. We don't know what he said. We do know it had a good send-off, and we know how it was received. Here is Le Figaro, which is, it says the ship of Friendship, filled with 500 boxcars, has arrived in Le Havre. So it is basically saying we made it. Now look at this ship was rechristened for this crossing the Friendship. At every station in France, the same thing as happened in the United States. Hundreds of people there to wave flags and to say yes. So what Drew Pearson did was he brought publicity. There was so much publicity. This train is delivering food from America to you. And the train went from Paris to Dijon to Lyon to Avignon, all the way down to Marseille, and at every stop there were all of these hundreds of people to celebrate it. I love this picture. There is Drew Pearson, who is in the middle, but I love it more because of the small woman there, whose name is Gabrielle Griswold, and she is the woman to whom I dedicated the book. She turned 97 2 weeks ago. She's wonderful, and it is her newspaper clippings that I'm showing in this presentation. She was the secretary of the group that organized how would the goods of the friendship train be distributed. And think about this. Pearson had no idea how many boxcars he was going to get across the country. So the French didn't have any idea of what they might receive. And yet what they decided to do is that most of the food would go to the children of France through the schools. Through the schools, so they'd get an extra snack at the schools so that it wouldn't be diverted into the black market, which was robust. Some of the food would go to the elderly, victims of disaster. So everything is going brilliantly. The schools are receiving the food. Wait a minute. Yeah. The schools are receiving the food. Everything is going absolutely perfectly. They are getting publicity in every stop. It is food from America that is coming here. So we have, it just looks like a perfectly smooth ride. The unions aren't making any problems. Everything was going well until January 31st, January 30th actually, and it was published on January 31st. January 1948, the communist arsonists burnt the entrepôt, the warehouse where all the food was stored. 30,000 tons of food went up in flame. Now, this was not from the friendship train, only from the friendship train. In fact, it was just a small amount from the friendship train because most of the food from the ships that had already docked were already at stations around the country. But this warehouse housed food from every democratic country that was giving food to France. And in fact, it backfired because people were so upset. There was no way to replace this food. You couldn't go to Kmart or, you couldn't, it didn't exist. And so it was really a terrible tragedy. And what they had to do was redirect. The food that had been designated for the schools of Paris and the Seine was destroyed. So what they did is they took the elderly out of the equation so that the children all throughout France would receive food. Which brings us to the train of gratitude. One of the 49 boxcars is right here in the back of the room. The train of gratitude, or the train de la reconnaissance française, is linked to the friendship train by timing because it began to be planned in December of 1947, right after the friendship train, the goods from the friendship train came to France. It is also linked to the friendship train by a letter written by two veterans, André Picard and Louis Cast, who said, and I have to read this because France must respond with a gift that is worthy of France and also worthy of those who twice in a quarter century have shed their blood for liberating and safeguarding France's brilliance. So the Merci train was a thank you for the food that had come in friendship, but it's much, much more than that. It's a thank you to our veterans, to the people who fought in those wars. I took a picture several weeks ago, and here it is, but you have the real thing right back there. What the organizers of the Merci train decided to do was search all throughout France looking for boxcars that could be refurbished and sent. They wanted 49. We only had 48 states at the time, but they wanted one to be shared between Hawaii and Washington, D.C. Hawaii was not yet a state, but the Hawaiians insisted, nickel by nickel, dime by dime, they bought two boxcar loads of sugar to send on the train to France, which was quite a precious commodity. So I love this picture because it's this huge, massive, massive ship. And it's in kind of the reverse of what happened to Drew Pearson. Pearson had arranged for one ship to take the goods across the ocean. He needed 4. The French had arranged for 4 ships to take those boxcars across the ocean. In the end, after they found this ship, they only needed 1, because this ship had been built by the Germans to be used in World War II. But it was never commissioned to go into World War II. Instead, the Magellan was recommissioned with this, with bringing the gifts of gratitude from France to the United States. This is a picture from Life magazine in 1949. This picture tells a big story because that ship, the Merci America, held all the boxcars. But all the dignitaries were not in that ship. France was sending dignitaries to meet with American dignitaries because this is a big diplomatic effort between 2 countries who are fighting for democracy in the midst of this Cold War. And there's this frantic and lovely transcript between the 2 captains. The captain of the ship with the dignitary said, "Hey, wait, slow down. Just hang off the coast. Don't go into the harbor because we're 2 days behind you." Anybody who knows anything about the speed of a vessel across the water knows that it has everything to do, or something to do, with the waterline length. This ship was really fast. They were 2 days ahead of the dignitaries. The captain of the ship with the boxcars says, well, can't happen. We've already been spotted. And so the ship with the boxcars comes in, and of course, though, they wait to have the big party in New York at the Waldorf Astoria until the dignitaries come. I also really love this picture because imagine being wait staff trying to get between those tables. I don't know quite how they would have done it. While so all of the boxcars were being unloaded, being sent to different parts of the country, they went to every state's capital. The one that was being shared between Washington and Hawaii went directly to Washington, D.C., where one of the first gifts was unloaded. And I always kind of choke up at different parts of this talk, but this is one of them. Because one of the first gifts they unloaded was they had a flame from the tomb of the unknown soldier in France, which they mingled with the flame of the unknown soldier at Arlington. So again, the symbolism of these 2 democracies fighting and working together. So back to Idaho, here is your boxcar, and I notice that almost the same photo is back here. If you want a closer look at it, here is the actual original train. You can see that this says Gratitude Train, and here on this side it says Train de la Reconnaissance Française. That's because there's a French side and an English side, and that's basically the way it breaks down. In Boise, too, the train was paraded through Boise, and all of the gifts that were in the boxcar were on display in the Capitol Rotunda for that week of Washington's birthday, 1949. France, by the way, had tried to get their gift to America by Christmas. They wanted it kind of linked, just as the friendship train had made it to France by Christmas. They wanted to, but they got a little bit delayed. So it made it across the country at different times. In these last slides, I'm just going to give you a few snippets of the things that were on the train. There is no inventory that survives. We estimate that about 52,000 gifts were on the train, but that is an estimate at best, because if you have 12 toy soldiers in a set, is that 1 or is that 12? It depends on who was counting. Many of the gifts, they really range, and I'll go through kind of the type of gift that was there. The way they were collected was through the railroad lines in France, people could just come up and give a box, and they would be give a box or a book or a box of things, and they would be added to the train. What is most touching for me are the notes. The other way we can do an estimate is only one state in the Union, that's Arizona, kept all of their gifts in the State Museum. And that's because their governor at the time, Governor Garvey, said the only way that all Arizonans can benefit from this gift is if we keep it in the state. So there's a lot on World War I. Those are Prussian helmets, so the conquered army. There's kind of souvenirs, many, many souvenirs from the war, both World War I and World War II. The big, large vase is trench art, and I chose this one not because of its beauty, although it is beautiful. Most of the trench art was made either by active soldiers or by POWs. Some were made actually on the field, some were made behind the lines, but I chose this because of the note. And this note says, it is from Madame Georges Terrine, and she says basically that I'm offering this gift, this vase, which I cherish because my husband made it when he was fighting at the Somme in World War I. It was called the Great War, of course. He was fighting at the Somme with American soldiers. There were also many kind of institutional things that went to every boxcar. There's a collection of, this is the one from Arizona, but there's a collection of commemorative coins which mingle leaders of France with leaders of the United States. So on this commemoration, there's Eisenhower, there's Patton, and there's George Washington. The small painting is of the surrender of the German army at Rheims in 1945. But France wanted the U.S. to remember them for more than the wars, and they wanted us to remember France as the height of haute couture. And they therefore had 2.5-foot tall dolls with absolutely perfectly tailored garments from a couple of hundred centuries. There were 49 dolls from different periods of fashion, and there was supposed to be one doll per boxcar, but they determined that the collection would make more sense if it stayed together. So all 49 dolls are in New York in the Metropolitan Museum. I was unable to see them, but I did get into the archives where there was an original edition of a book, which I have just been told by Steve over here, who is a member of the 48, the 40 and 8 Society, that these, actually not these dresses, but the wedding dress, but there's a book available for people to look at. This archival book that I found is of the dolls, and occasionally I suppose they're on display. On this same slide I put a wedding dress because every boxcar held a wedding dress. My guess is that a lot of them went to the governor's daughters or something like that, governor's nieces, somebody, because the governor in every state could determine what happened and how the gifts were distributed. In most states, the toys went to orphanages, books to libraries, art to museums. Some states had contests. You could see if you could win the right to wear this wedding dress, and some states said you had to be marrying a veteran. Some states had other kinds of ways that you could run for it, but the main thing is you had to fit it. The bride had to fit it, and it's about a size 2 today. Now, this is art, and so some of the gifts in the boxcars were actually fine art, and one of my favorites is the one in the upper left corner, which is the Winged Victory of Samothrace, which is on the 4th floor of your Capitol Rotunda, and it is how I got interested in this story. I was here actually presenting another book that I wrote, Sons at War, and I always go to a cemetery, a Capitol if I can, and a museum, and there in the Capitol I said, what is that doing here? The original is on the grand staircase at the Louvre in Paris, and I thought, what is that doing here? And here's this tiny little card saying, this came on the Merci train in 1949. And thus began my journey of learning about what was on that train. Why did it come? Who brought the stuff? Where did the stuff come from? All the rest are by famous artists, and they are in different states. Oh, I have a pointer here. This whole time I've had my own pointer. The picture of Benjamin Franklin, the bust of Benjamin Franklin was made by a famous sculptor, Houdin, and that's in Philadelphia. The painting of George Washington is in Washington, D.C. The art went to the National Gallery, and I also included the Sèvres vase on this slide because every boxcar had a vase. Again, my guess is that many of them went to the governors, or maybe they went to the chair of the Friendship Committee or the Merci Train Committee, which in fact were the same group. Whoops, went too fast. Most of the gifts, however, were not valuable. Most of the gifts were painted ceramic things like that piggy bank or the plates. The toy soldiers, I actually talked to the man who had been 10 years old when he received them. He had a pen-pal relationship with a 10-year-old in France who had sent them. There's a beadwork, again, kind of a call to fashion, and there were many, many thousands of dolls. And the reason there were thousands of dolls is because our delegate to the United Nations at the time was Eleanor Roosevelt. And on the air, she was asked, what should we send? And she said, send dolls. Send dolls to the children. Send them in your native dress. The final one on this page is the Renault cars. And I included this, they are toys, but more importantly because it underscores what was happening in France. The Renault factory was in that part of France called the Free Zone, but in fact it was run from Berlin. When they first moved into France, the Germans were going to take the factory and move it to Germany. Renault said, no, keep it here. I will continue to employ some French people. And that is true. But beginning in 1941, after France fell, and before 1945, when the peace was made, the Renault factory also made armored vehicles for Germany. As a result, Renault himself did not meet with a positive end. At the end of the war, people were arrested for pro-Nazi sympathies, for pro-Nazi actions. He did not get to trial. He was murdered when he was in custody. I love this candy dish because it is a Limoges candy dish and it's chipped, and I love it for this reason. The note that came with it is from Madame Bouthier, and she writes that she is 64 years old. She's a victim of disaster. She doesn't have very much, and she really apologizes for this candy dish being chipped. But she lost everything on June 15th, 1944, when Angoulême, which is her town, had been bombed. She ends the note by saying, if my means were as great as my gratitude, my gift would be much bigger. What she doesn't write, but what she must have known, is that the flying fortresses that went over Angoulême on June 15th, 1944, were American. So she lost her home. 400 other people lost their home to American bombers who were aiming for the German train station, but they missed, and they instead hit these homes. Still, she ends thanking America for liberating them from their oppressors. I include this picture because it's a children's drawing. There were many, many children's drawings. This was obviously a school assignment, and I chose this one because this is from Nebraska. And of the 49 boxcars, all but 5 survive in various states of repair or disrepair. This one is in great shape with the Idaho Historical Society and with the 40 and 8 group helping to make it right. But Nebraska sold their boxcar for junk for $45. But they've redeemed themselves in my eyes a little bit because they have a wonderful website that shows many of the gifts that they received. And this group of children's drawings is one of them. The very last picture I'm going to share with you is a beautiful and simple copper and brass teapot, which was given by a plumber named Alfred Neames, and he wrote on his note, it's in a very tiny script on a business card, because he wanted to thank America for liberating him from Dachau. And I can never get through that. On May 1st, 1945. And this was what he wanted to give to the train. So you can see I've chosen the very simple gifts of the 52,000, and thousands are out there, gifts that really touch because they are people to people. The vase that somebody's husband made next to an American soldier in the Somme, the copper teapot that was made and sent from someone who was liberated from Dachau. So that is the end of my presentation, thankfully. And, oh gosh, JC, I just made it just on time to answer any questions that anyone might have. Yes?
I've been wondering since the beginning, how did the food not spoil?
Oh, thank you for asking that. I should have clarified. The team of the Friendship Train coordinated with the Secretary of Agriculture to see A, what they needed, and B, how to box these things, how to do these. And professionals actually did that for them. Again, the Teamsters and food, this was all done. So there are some kind of fun stories from New Jersey. There was a group of women who had pickled some things, and they're all in glass jars, and they get to the station and say, no, 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 no. Washington State wanted to send a box load of apples, and they said, no, 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 no. Those won't make it. So there were certain guidelines, very limited things of what could be sent. Yes, Steve.
I'll make is the people who are interested in this, you go to mercytrain.org. There's a link. You can look at every car in every state with pictures of what's in the car, what's not. So if you're interested in history, it's a rabbit hole you're going to have to go down.
And also, if you're interested in the history, Steve and other members of the 40 and 8, they are all veterans. They all hang out here at certain times on Saturday, and we'll answer any questions that you might have about that. Yes?
So when the trains arrived, they arrived obviously from the Atlantic Ocean. Then were they trained across, or were they each train was shipped to, or how did they get to each state? How were they dispersed?
Oh, good question. They were divided in New York so that they went. There was a group that went to the northeast, a group that went to the southwest, et cetera. So they were all trained across and brought directly to the capital. Yeah. And some of them, of course, if the capital didn't have a train track through it, then they were trucked or some way. But they all got to the capital. That was kind of the unifying thing. Yes.
What happened to the communist movement in France after World War II?
What happened to the communist movement? Well, the Cold War did not end for many, many years. And so there's still a strand of dissent. Charles de Gaulle, in the end, won. France is and has remained a democracy, but there is a very definite, and was for a long time, a very definite communist strand. They were not, it was a complicated thing because for a while, the communists and the pro-democracy movement had a common enemy, and that was the German fascists. But then when it ended, and there was definitely, it was either going to be communist or democratic, then the lines were drawn. Good question.
I had a question. Would you want to tell us just a little bit about your other book, the one that you said started your research into?
Yeah, sure. JC asked me also to mention this other book, which is called Sons at War, and that actually initiated my my research into World War II. And that book was the genesis of that idea. As I found my uncle's war diary, which began on the day Pearl Harbor was bombed and ends 10 days before he was shot and killed over North Africa. He was a fighter pilot. He flew British Spitfires. In my family, there was kind of a myth that before Uncle Ted went down, he shot the German down who shot him down. So when I found his war diary, I thought, I wonder if that is true. And there's one thing that the Germans do very, very well, and that is record keeping. So I researched, and I found the family, and I actually found the godson of the man who killed my uncle. And I found that it was true, that my uncle had killed him. That the Ted Sweetland was Joachim Müncheberg's 134th kill. He was a German ace. He was very famous in Germany. And Joachim Müncheberg was Ted Sweetland's first. He was a rookie. So that was, I did a deep dive into the history of World War II and what makes people believe what they believe. Because if you put pictures, and there are pictures in this book, if you put pictures side by side of Joachim Müncheberg and Ted Sweetland, they look like they might have been cousins. So if my uncle had grown up in Germany, would he have been a Nazi? That's the kind of question that I was wondering. What are we teaching our children? So that is Sons at War, and that is also available evidently at the bookstore. So there you go. Yes?
That's an amazing story. I couldn't put that down. Sons at War.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'll also do a little little self-promotion on that. That one got a really good Kirkus review, which is also known as Kick-Ass review, so I was really happy with that. So, any other questions? Yes?
Are you from Idaho?
No, I'm not. I now have family that's sitting right behind you who lives in Idaho, and my sister-in-law is from Idaho, but I am not. I live in Nevada. I live in Zephyr Cove, Nevada. Zephyr Cove on Lake Tahoe. Any other questions? Thank you again so much for being here.